Hey, what's up, YouTube? This right here is probably the most annoying sound you can get out of your synthesizer, which is just the shortest possible click, known as an impulse, that sounds like this. Now, annoying as it is, it's actually super useful, because I have this lush effects chain that I like, made of delays, reverbs, convolution, more reverb, and EQ, and it sounds like this when you put the impulse response through it, if we were to record it, which is still annoying. But this recording we just captured is called an impulse response. It's the response of our plugins to that click sound. And this impulse response captures like the fingerprint of all these effects. And if we were to load this impulse response into a convolution plugin, we can simulate that entire effects chain. Let's check this out. I'm going to turn off the original effects chain and enable this convolution plugin, which has our impulse response loaded. Now, here's what it sounds like on a loop. Let's hear what it sounds like with the original effects. Now just dry with no effects. One more time with the actual Ableton effects. And one more time with the convolution. I think that's super neat. You can 100% realistically simulate all of these effects with a single convolution plugin and this impulse response. Impulse response can capture the fingerprint or the DNA of different effects, acoustic spaces, microphones, speaker cabinets, and I think it's super neat. So let's dive in a little deeper. So impulse responses are obviously extremely powerful, and it actually isn't intimidating to get started with it. Like this Convolution XT plugin is free. You can download it, and it comes with a factory library of impulse responses from, different famous plate reverbs. You can even get acoustic real spaces. Like these are acoustic impulse responses from cathedrals, caverns, dance studios, like really cool stuff. And you can just throw these right on your mixes and just turn up the mix knob, and you've got your music now in a real acoustic cavern, which is a really cool property of convolution, that you can simulate acoustic spaces. But it's also not too difficult to get one level deeper and record your own impulse responses. Like I just showed you how to fingerprint like digital effects, but you can also get analog effects. Like I have this Holy Stain effect pedal lying around my studio, and I've always liked the tone. It's a multi-effects with like reverb, distortion, but I've mostly turned those off for most of my impulse responses. I just wanted to capture the tone of it, which is kind of like the EQ settings of it, more or less. And I've done the same thing where I've taken this phase plant annoying impulse sample, output through that my audio interface into the effects pedal, and back into the input of my audio interface to record the response of my effects pedal to the impulse. And I have loaded those up into my convolution plugin. There's all the holy grail at all of these different like dark, warm, bright settings. And we can throw that on our digital synthesizers now without having to have the pain of routing audio out of our audio interface, which is I'm usually too lazy to do. So now that I've recorded the impulse responses, I might finally start using the holy grail on my digital synths. So let's see what that sounds like. That's without, and it's quite bright. Let's see if we can warm it up. Yeah, I like this bright one. Let's check this out. Yeah, I like this bright one, but maybe this mix needs more of a darker tone so that this synth doesn't overpower. So let's check that out. Sweet. So yeah, it's not too hard to go one level deeper, start recording your own impulse responses. But disclaimer, I'm going to get even more technical, and I'm going to talk about how impulse responses work and how convolution works. Because for me, my art form is kind of like art meets science, and I'm always trying to figure out how things work, go one level deeper. I find that's what gives me the most inspiration, when I kind of figure out how something works. And then I can have like a realization of, oh, like maybe if I tweak this, I can get a really cool sound. Or like, oh, like now that I know how it works, I understand why this little thing is making my mixes suck so bad. So maybe if I adjust this, or if I stop doing this, maybe my mixes will suck less. So if you're like me and you're always trying to understand things more, definitely stick around and let's dive into how impulse responses work. Okay, so the first important thing to understand about impulse responses is what they can and can't simulate, because we've talked about the wide range of things that they can simulate, from acoustic spaces to speaker cabinets, and it might be a little confusing if you don't understand what those things have in common to understand the limitations. Like, you might be wondering, well, could I just run an impulse into my favorite distortion pedal or into like a tape saturator and then use that impulse response to make a nice, accurate simulation of tape saturation, for example? And the answer is no, and that is because impulse responses can only accurately characterize linear time invariant systems. And I'll explain what that means. Linear means that when we process the combined input, it will be the exact same thing as if we processed each input separately and then combined them. And I'll give an example if that is a little confusing. The other part to make it linear is that if we scale the input, the output scales by the same factor, which is like the exact opposite of a distortion, which is like or a saturation, which is the like most typical type of nonlinear system. And that's kind of the whole point of distortion or saturation, that if we scale the input some factor or add drive to our saturator, the output will scale by a different factor. And the time invariant part really just means that there's no time-dependent automations or modulations. So like if our impulse response can characterize like a filter, but if we add an LFO on that filter to start making it wobble or whatever, an impulse response can no longer characterize that. It's kind of needs to characterize a static system. So the linear system example, it's a little confusing in words, but it's actually really simple. It just means that like if we had a kick drum and a snare drum, and we ran those separately on their own reverbs, and then looked at that signal when we combined it, it'd be the exact same thing as if we first combined the kick and snare into a single signal, and ran that signal into the reverb and looked at that output. We get the same result. And I can actually show that over here. I have in this group no effects on the group chain, but the kick and snare each have reverbs with the exact same setting. And over here, I've just duplicated the same kick and snare drum, but with no processing on the individual channels. But now we have the same reverb on the group. And if we listen to each one individually, they sound the same, but we can even prove that they are actually exactly the same because they will phase cancel. So if I play both of these channels together, but I've phase inverted this second group, we get silence, and you can show that there's actually no output on the master bus Whereas if we turned off this phase cancel, we get a very loud output on our master bus when they combine. So yeah, that's exactly what I mean by linear system, is that they, when you process them separately, it's the same thing as processing them combined. And actually, just from that linear, if you like call a system linear, that already is enough to start building intuition on why an impulse response describes it. Because like in this first kind of chain where we have the impulse running into the linear system and we get the impulse response on the output, well, like especially when we're in the digital audio domain, it's so easy to picture that any audio waveform, like I'm just showing this kick drum, for example, it's really just a series of impulses. So I just kind of drew a series of impulses down there. It might not exactly match the kick drum, but whatever the kick drum is in a digital audio format, it's just a series of impulses. So just like in the last example where we showed if you combine if we know what the output of the kick drum is, and we put a separate signal and it'd be the same as combining it. Just like if we had this impulse response processed separately from this series of impulses, as long as we know what one of these impulses look like, we know that the series of impulses, or like any audio waveform, will just be a linear combination of the impulse responses. And in practice, the way we get this linear combination of impulse responses is by using convolution with the impulse response. So let's talk about convolution next. Okay, the second property I think that is important to understand should be really comfortable for audio engineers. It should be grounding because audio engineers spend so much time thinking about the spectral domain, experiencing it, and manipulating it, that they should be really comfortable with the spectral domain. So it should feel very grounding to know that convolution with signals in the time domain is the same thing as if we were to convert these signals to the spectral domain and then multiply them together. So for example, a filter like Pro Q3, where we are very comfortable with this sort of like filter shape. We understand that this filter shape means that it's high over here, and it just lets these signals pass. Like in the spectral domain, it's just multiplying our input by 1 for the signal, the part of the signal that's in these this section of the frequency domain. But signals above this 500 hertz cutoff essentially get cut off, or they get multiplied by a really low number, like less than minus 100 dB up here. Like it's essentially multiplying it by 0 up here. So what the second property is saying is that really what's going under the hood in these plugins, I can guarantee you that the majority of these plugins, I think including Pro Q3, are doing convolution under the hood to implement this filter shape. Because converting to the time domain and then doing multiplication, that's just too computationally expensive, causes too much latency. So unless your signal is really so long that it eventually at a certain signal length, it actually is worth it to go to the Fourier domain, but the majority of these plugins are going to be doing convolution. But all that's saying is that this property is saying that it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if you do convolution or if you think about it as multiplying the spectrum by this amount. It's the exact same thing. So under the hood, ProQ has some impulse response that when you take the Fourier transform of that impulse response, it has the shape of this filter. And when we convolve with that impulse response, it's the same thing as if we were to just, pass the low frequencies through and cut off the high frequencies. And we can take a look at what that, let's turn this to 0 latency. We don't need linear phase. And then if we were to export this impulse response, we would, let's call this low pass. And now if we load it in our convolver, we we are now cutting off this loop at 500 hertz. In fact, it should be doing the exact same thing as if we put Pro Q on this channel. We can now get rid of the convolver to compare with Pro Q3. Also cutting off at 500 hertz over here. Same thing as with the convolver. Yeah, so that's kind of just the main point I want to drive home is that convolution, it's not really easy to like look at an impulse response and know what it's going to do, at least not without a lot of practice. But you can look at the Fourier transform of that signal and understand what it's doing, especially when we're talking about the impulse response of things like EQs, filters, speaker cabinets. Those are really just going to have a well-defined frequency, what's the right word? I guess like a spectral envelope or a way that it's adding character to the frequency spectrum. And I think as audio engineers, it's a lot easier for us to think of it in that way. Then the next property I want to talk about, we kind of just showed, or we just used this property, which is that if we use an impulse response as an input to a convolution, the output is the convolution kernel itself. So we've talked about this a lot already, that just an impulse characterizes the system. But all that means is that like whatever convolution Pro Q is using under the hood to implement this filter, this very steep 96 dB filter, under the hood, it is, under the hood, it has some convolution filter. When we put an impulse into this, which we just did with phase plant, this is our impulse signal going into it. Our output that we just loaded into our convolver, that looks like this. That will be the same convolution kernel as what would be inside Pro Q3. Let's keep going. The next property that audio engineers should know is the associative property. So this means that the order of convolution does not matter. The end result is the same no matter which order you perform convolution operations in. So audio engineers don't need to worry about the order of their EQs, reverbs, and delays. If you do EQ before reverb or reverb before EQ, you'll get exactly the same result. And I can actually demonstrate that right here. I have a drum channel with EQ before a reverb, and it sounds like this. And if we duplicate this channel, solo it, and put the reverb before the EQ, it sounds like this. So it sounds similar, but if we want to prove it, how we do this is phase cancel our second copy, or rather we're going to phase invert this second copy and show that it phase cancels with the original sample. So let's turn off the phase cancellation and it will just be a louder version. But now if we phase invert the second copy, we get absolutely no signal. You can see on the master, it's negative infinity dB. So perfectly phase cancels. The order of your EQs, your reverbs, anything that's linear, anything that's using convolution, order does not matter. So spend your time worrying about the order of your other components, like your nonlinear components, rather than worrying about the order of these components. Okay, you made it to the funnest part of the video, where we're going to use convolution in creative or abstract ways. And no doubt that the kind of bread and butter of convolution is simulating more realistic spaces, like getting impulse responses from cathedrals, halls, or like famous microphones like Newman microphones, or famous speaker cabinets. That's like the bread and butter. But you don't have to use like standard impulse responses. You can really put any signal you want in as an impulse response and use it as a convolution source. And remember that one of our properties of convolution is that convolving two signals together is the same thing as multiplying their spectral characteristics together. So if the shaker loop that we're inputting in, has its spectral characteristics over there, and the marimba has its own spectral characteristics, and they're going to multiply together. And that can give really interesting results that kind of makes the sound become somewhere in between the two samples. So let's just listen to what that sounds like. Let's add a kick drum, and I will show you another example where we're going to put this on a snare sample. Now the snare sample dry sounds like this. But I'm going to put this synth sample underneath, which sounds like this. So if we put that synth sample into the convolution reverb, we're going to multiply the spectral characteristics together, and it'll sound like this. See how much fatter it sounds with the convolution enabled? That synth sample adds a lot of low end to our snare. Let's put a ghost snare on, some toms just to fill things up. Let's throw this ARP on. Okay, let's look at this bass. This is one of the weirdest things you can do with convolution. This isn't just a one-shot sample. This is actually a chord loaded up. This time I'm using Convolution XT. Let's see. This chord sounds like this. By the way, you can maybe tell that's high passed. I find it's very helpful if you're going to throw chords into a convolution. Cut out the low end, because the low end is going to get really loud really quick. It'll usually resonate in a really weird way. So just the high end of the supersaw is sent into this convolution as the impulse response. And the bass on its own sounds like this. But put it with this chord as the convolution signal, and this is what we get. Reminds me a lot of Justice. I don't know if they actually used this trick or if they just sent like chords through like amps or whatever, but whatever it is, I dig it. Check this out. Now, this convolution is a specific chord. So like if you want to try different bass notes, it's a little bit tricky to just use one chord. That might not sound so good. So I have these different layers, which each layer has a different supersaw chord as the convolution source. So like this next one is a D major. Then I have a F minor and a G sharp minor. No, a G minor. And all those samples together sounds like this. Sick. I hope you learned something about convolution. I know we dove deep. It's probably a super long video, so thanks for sticking with me. But at the same time, we probably only scratched the surface of convolution. It's a deep topic. So if there's anything you think I missed, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what properties of convolution are good to understand, so that we can make some sick sounds. So let me know. If you want to see more content like this, follow along on my channel. I've been posting weekly tutorials lately. So catch you next time.